Sherman is the, I always get it wrong, but he's the West Point historian. I know I'm saying it wrong, but he's responsible each year for the history of what happens at West Point. In the meantime, he wrote a few years ago the wonderful book, History May Be Searched in Vain, A Military History of the Mormon Battalion. Outstanding book, which gives us the perspective of the battalion, from the military perspective, for 1 year that they were actually an enlisted Army battalion. Then he gives the perspective from the Army, from the Army's way the Army looked at the prison of the Army. So without any further ado, I'll turn the time over to Sherman Fleek.
Like Greg said, I'm the command historian of the United States Military Academy at West Point. I did not attend the military academy. I would have never made it in there. I went to BYU, and I see that Pratt Call was up here on the thing. Is Pratt still with us? Pratt was about 2 years, well, he graduated the year I started ROTC. So anyway, so I'm responsible for the history of West Point, and we're going to talk about some West Point isms tonight, because Jerome had asked me to talk about the commanders of the Mormon Battalion, which we'll do. And I have jotted down about 7 or 9 points I want to talk about. But I was hoping, Marianne and others, is we can have a discussion instead of just me talking and blasting for, what are we talking, 20 minutes? Is that what we're doing, about 20 minutes?
That would be fine.
Okay. So I'm going to throw out some questions as I go along, some points, and I just like people to chime in. Is that all right, Jerome?
You bet.
We'll have a discussion. So the Academy, United States Military Academy, 1802, founded a year after Brigham Young was born. And James Allen, the first commander, graduated in 1829 with some notable Civil War personalities. The most famous, of course, is Robert Edward Lee. Joseph E. Johnston, who commanded several Confederate armies and served on the Utah campaign, was in his class. Leonidas Polk, Fort Polk, Louisiana, which is going to be renamed with all the other Confederate forts, named forts, in the next year or two. He served in that. He was in the class of 29, and it's kind of interesting. So I just want to read a line from the obituary for Phillip St. George Cooke. Now, he was class of 1827. And let me just start it off this way. Now, this obituary is in the annual report of the Association of Graduates, which was established in 1869, 4 years after the Civil War. And it was a way and means that the graduates could come together. I'm emphasizing West Point a little bit because I know a lot about it, and probably more than you folks. So there you go. and all four the four regular Army officers were all graduates, all of them. P. St. George Cooke, James Allen, George Stoneman, and Andrew Jackson Smith. They all attended the academy. And so the Association of Graduates started in 1869. There is some myth about it now that it was set up to heal the wounds of the Civil War. That's not necessarily true. It came to that around the turn of the century as reconciliation came along, and of course the lost cause myth of the South and everything crept in. So I want to read this from the obituary of P. St. George Cooke. It is with the sense of deep sorrow and personal loss that the duty is undertaken to prepare for the Alumni Association a record of his old and honored chief, Brigadier General and Brevet Major General Phillip St. George Cooke, United States Army retired, whom had just passed away in the last few months. All right. There's something there that's kind of interesting. the person who wrote this is his name is Edward Davis. He was about 10 years behind Cooke, but they served together at West Point. He called him Brigadier General and then Brevet Major General. So does anyone have any thoughts or ideas why Cooke had these two titles or two distinctions?
Doesn't brevet mean that he was doing the job, but he hadn't had it approved, or some legal issues that didn't give him the rank at that time?
Yeah, he'd been selected for advancement, but didn't have it pinned on yet.
Well, brevet is a temporary rank based on a position, and brigadier general was his permanent rank.
Was one for volunteers and one for regular Army?
Okay, keep going. Let's keep this going. This is good. You guys are hitting some good hot spots. Anyone else? Has anyone thought about this? Ever wondered about it when you read through the records and the muster rolls and stuff? What the fetch is this brevet thing, you know? Where did it come from? Okay, anyone else? So brevet is French. I'm not a French speaker, but it means in lieu of or temporary or something like that. And in the U.S. Army at this time, a brevet rank was several things. When a graduate left academy, as Stoneman did in 46, there was no opening vacancies in the regiment he was assigned to, so he was a brevet second lieutenant. Was he getting paid? Yes, Congress paid him, all right? Brevet is an honorary promotion also. That's why Cooke was a brevet major general. He was a brigadier general at the time of his retirement. He was paid as such, and then when he died in 1895, that was his highest rank held. You come to West Point, and I'll just throw out this invitation right now. Folks, you have about 2 more years. If you get to New York City, even close, Pennsylvania, I don't care, and you got an afternoon to come to the U.S. Military Academy, I am telling you, and I know I work here, and I've been here for 12 years, it's like visiting the White House. It's like visiting the Capitol building. It is an institution. You'll be amazed what we have here. And so that's my open invitation to you.
Well, and let me add to that, Sherman. This is Val Halford. Sherman is one of the most gracious hosts that you will ever come across. Not only are you invited to see the academy as you would a regular tourist, but he'll show you places and you will see and experience the nuances that institution holds. It's really, really a wonderful experience. So just, again, echoing what I've said in the past, I'm extremely grateful, Sherman, for taking the time to show me the academy like I'm sure nobody else possibly could. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome, Val. So out in our cemetery, we have an obelisk for a guy named George Armstrong Custer. Maybe you've heard of him. On one side of it, it has Lieutenant Colonel 7th Cavalry. On the other side, it has U.S. Major General USV. And then on the other side, it has Brevet MG Major General. So here we have all 3 aspects that was in play in 1846 when the Mexican War started, when the battalion was mustered. You have the militia. The militia started in this country in 1636 at Plymouth Colony. All the colonies had militia. Militia goes back to England and many other European countries too. It's the citizen soldier aspect. Muster days, anyone, male, white males in America, more or less, age 18, sometimes 15, up to age 45, were enrolled in militia. That's what they used a lot during the Revolution. And then the Continental Army was more of a standard there. And by the War of 1812, they realized that the militia, the enrolled militia where everyone's enrolled, wasn't working. Another thing about the Constitution with the militia, it is not an expeditionary force. The militia from the Constitution could not cross borders. The battalion crossed out of the United States and entered what? Mexican territory. So the battalion were volunteers. So we'll just put that on the shelf for a moment. So you got these three different categories of service. You can be in the regular army, which is standard by law. Congress every 2 years establishes the army. It's funny that the Navy has been established since 1795, and they just give it more money. But every year by law, every 2 years by law, the Army has to be reappropriated. Why? Because the founding fathers were afraid of a standing army because of their experience in England, with Great Britain. So the regular army, all right? Then you've got the militia state. Who's the commander-in-chief of the militia? The governor, territorial governor or state governor, right? And then the militia can be called up, and there were two laws passed in 1790, 1792, the Militia Act, 1794, the Calling Forth Act. That's gave the president authority in Congress to call up the militia for emergencies and defending the United States. But they were not allowed to go as an expeditionary force overseas. That was not changed until 1916, when the Mexican punitive expedition was. There was 120,000 guardsmen, which is the militia, down on the border in Texas and Arizona that couldn't cross over because they weren't authorized. But the next year we went to war against Germany, and National Guard units, because of the new law, 1916, allowed the National Guard, the old militia, to be an expeditionary force. So what's unique about the Mormon Battalion is, who did James Allen go to with his orders to muster this new battalion? What official?
Brigham Young.
That's right. Was he a politician? Well, later.
not in the sense of running for office, but he was the voice of the Mormon movement at the time.
So he's the presiding authority in ecclesiastical role. But he had no political authority in Iowa, correct?
Yeah.
Is that not unique? I am telling you, it's extremely unique, because the way it works is the War Department, with the president's approval, says, all right, Maryland, we need 3 regiments of this, New Hampshire, 2 regiments of that, Illinois, like Missouri. They asked for 3 mounted regiments originally, and then they had the artillery battalion under Meriwether Clark, Lewis Clark, okay? So that was the levy, okay? Iowa did produce some troops, but the Saints just happened to be in Iowa. They had nothing to do with the territorial governor, territorial legislature, or anything. James Allen went to a church leader to get permission and his support to muster in 500 odd troops. That is so unique. So the battalion is different than the Missourians and the Illinois and the New Yorkers, who were from the militia, the governor offering these people up, and then they changed their status from militia. They are mustered into federal service. Federal service. Now they're under the Articles of War and not the laws and of the state of Missouri or the state of whatever, or the territory of Iowa. All right. Does that make sense? Anyone questions or thoughts there?
And that's
all right.
And that's so why we should never refer to it as the Mormon Battalion of Iowa.
Yep. Now the Iowans are, I think, proud of the battalion, and they mention that and they claim it, and that's fine. They can do what they want, but it is just absolutely strange or rare for a commissioned officer in the United States Army to approach a church leader and say, "Hey, Brigham, I need some help," and that's exactly what happened. Another interesting thing is when they did muster and they were doing all the recruiting there. How did the militia have their officers? How were the officers appointed in the militia? Anyone know about that aspect?
Yes, they were elected by the men themselves in their respective companies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So who was Alexander Doniphan? Who was that guy? He's a lawyer from Missouri, right?
He was a military officer.
Well, this is true. He was a brigadier general in the Missouri militia in 1838 when there was the fighting and the combat there in Missouri and far west, and he's the fella that more or less saved Joseph Smith's life, right? So in June of 46, he signs on as a private in the Missouri volunteers that are forming, and who mustered it into service? Captain James Allen, class 1829. And then they had the election, and Doniphan was elected because he had military experience with Missouri. He was a lawyer, a slave owner, and a few other things. And he was elected as the colonel of the regiment. But Brigham Young appointed all the officers and the non-commissioned officers in the battalion. That, again, is just so rare and unusual. All right, so who is James Allen? What do we know about this guy? What's his background? All right, anyone want to chip in here real quick? Who is James Allen?
Well, he was a captain officer.
Go ahead, someone.
He was a captain stationed at Fort Leavenworth.
That's right. With the 1st Dragoons under Stephen Watts Kearny, and that's how I understand the name is said, Kearny. And class 1829, I said with Robert E. Lee. One time in his career, got in a little trouble for messing around with some of the documentation and funding and so on, got his hand slapped. But anyway, he was involved with the founding of Fort Des Moines on the Raccoon River there, and that became Des Moines, Iowa. He was also on the Henry Schoolcraft expedition in 1832 to find the source of the Mississippi River up there. So he's an infantry guy who becomes a cavalryman because the Dragoons established in 1833. He's class of 29. All right. And so he switches over and becomes a dragoon, which is a French term. There's cavalry, dragoons, and hussars, and so on. Heavy, medium, and light cavalry. So now he's doing these explorations like Lewis and Clark. He's out there he's building forts and so on and everything. He has a brother, Robert Allen, from Ohio. He's class of 1836. When the Civil War starts, he is one of the main logisticians in the West, quartermaster officer, under a guy named U.S. Grant. All right. So and here's the thing, Robert E. Lee, all those guys until 1843, guess who pointed them to the U.S. Military Academy to go to school? All right. You might know now who folks who go to Air Force Academy, Naval Academy, who appoints them more or less? Who nominates them? Congressmen, senators, presidential, yeah, at large, yes, absolutely. But until 1843, the Secretary of War did it. And who appointed James Allen? John C. Calhoun, all right, who was very much involved with the Civil War later, the secession crisis and all that, and he died just before the war. So it's just amazing to go back. So here's Allen and everything. I just so he meets with Brigham Young, and he Brigham Young solicited several promises from James Allen, Captain Allen. Do you recall what a couple of those promises were, agreements?
Well, one of them, Sherman, was the Mormons were trespassing in Iowa. They were staying on Potawatomi Reservation, Indian land.
Yes. Yes.
Allen promised Brigham Young that they could remain on that property throughout the winter.
Yes, and also cross over on the other side, right? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. What was a couple of the other promises, which had lasting effect the next year during their military service? What was another promise?
They would remain as a group and they could select their own officers.
Okay. Yeah. They were not to be divided, right? So, and then, okay. And if what happened to Allen if he died or was incapacitated? What was the promise there? The senior ranking Latter-day Saint officer would take charge. And who is that? A company.
Jefferson Hunt.
Jefferson Hunt. Huntsville, Utah is named after him. So, were all those promises broken? Well, one probably wasn't. For more or less, they were. It's just what happened militarily as you go out. But eventually, the Saints did have to leave the lands of about 3 or 4 years later. So they're on the march. They head down. Well, first of all, I just want to hit here the importance of mustering in on the 16th of July. They took the oath of office. They did it again in August. We know about that. Another mustering, because there's a very fluid situation. Some people didn't show up at Leavenworth, even though they signed up, and others joined, and some were non-members, and so on. It was a very fluid situation. And I just think, if you think about James Allen's personality, he obviously was a very what's the right word? Flexible individual. Okay. He was not like P. St. George Cooke. I think if Cooke was sent out to form the battalion, it would have been a whole different can of worms, you know, because Cooke had a whole different style. Okay, so now they go to Leavenworth and do that, and they're fitted out, and they're heading out and on the march and so on. And so what happens next? I mean, Allen dies, right? I think it's on the 23rd of August. He dies. He's at Leavenworth. Do we know what caused his death, James Allen?
I think the discussion was by one of the men who wrote an obituary for him, that he was possessed of some unfortunate habits, which suggest alcoholism.
Yeah, yeah. And I think he had a niece. He was not married, no children that we know of, and his niece was there taking care of him when he passed. And then we have another unique situation. We got a young, cocky officer from the class of 38. And what's his name? 1838.
A.J. Smith.
A.J. Smith. So he sees an opportunity to excel, as we do in the Army. So he wrote a letter to Brigham Young, along with his Dr. Sanderson, and asked permission to join and serve with the battalion. Here again, a commissioned officer asking permission from a church leader to be involved. Really unique. I hate to use the word unique so much. But anyway, he overtakes the battalion. They have a conference, and the officers of the battalion, the Latter-day Saints, deem it proper and advantageous to allow Smith to take over. Was he ever a bona fide commander of the Mormon Battalion, A.J. Smith?
He signs his muster rolls as acting lieutenant colonel, and Cooke goes along with that later on. He signs off on Smith having been the acting lieutenant colonel, but technically I don't think that washes, does it?
Right. There's a thing called orders, okay? In the military, you have to have orders for everything, awards, transfers, promotions. Those of us have had the opportunity to serve in the different services. Orders mean everything. So there's never any orders that we know of cut for him. He was an acting commander because Kearny sent Cooke back once he found out about Allen's demise. So Cooke. So A.J. Smith is acting commander, cocky, has some problems with John D. Lee and others, and he gets to be one of the tyrants of the battalion for a while. What kind of officer was he? What was his career like later? What did he do? Any thoughts there?
It seems like in the diaries they feel like he pushed them pretty hard.
He did? So if he graduated in 38, and he's out there on the plains for 8 years, and he's a dragoon too, but dragoons do a lot of walking like the infantry. So these were hardcore frontier officers. They did not mess around. Discipline and all that was so important. So that Latter-day Saints, bless them, they were not used to this kind of treatment, okay? Even Brigham Young told them, you know, to be kind and gentle and everything to the soldiers and so on, and Christ-like, and that's fine from a church leader. So there's that immediate clash, you know. A.J. Smith was as good and as proficient as probably any West Point graduate and frontier officer. Does that mean they were all perfect and good all the time? No, that's not at all true. But he had a tremendous career in the Civil War. And he, too, ended his career as a major general in the volunteers, okay? So in the volunteers, you have the rank, you have the authority, you get the money, but when that expedition or war or conflict or whatever is over, you go back to the rank you were before, all right? So A.J. Smith was the very first commander of the Gary Owen Regiment. What am I talking about? The 7th U.S. Cavalry, famous because of George Custer. And he defeated Nathan Bedford Forrest at the Battle of Tupelo in 1864. I think Edmund Kearny Smith was there too. So, all right, so he was acting commander. Cooke is sent back. Cooke, class 1827, 2 years ahead of Allen. So all these folks back in West Point at that time, they know everyone. There's only 80 or 200 young men there, just men there until 1976. They all knew each other. They all knew their strengths and weaknesses. That's why the Civil War was kind of interesting, because they knew who they were fighting against and so on. And so here's Cooke, and where's Cooke from?
Detroit, Michigan.
Well, that's where he's buried, right? Where is Cooke from? Do you know?
Pennsylvania.
It was Virginia, but was it actually in modern West Virginia? I'm a little fuzzy.
No, Leesburg,
okay.
That's still in Virginia. So here's an interesting thing. I just want to throw this out real quick. There were 7 colonels in the regular army, okay? 7 colonels from Virginia in the spring of 1861, 7. 6 of them stayed with the North and 1 did not. One of the 7 that stayed with the North was P. St. George Cooke, who served on the Utah campaign later. Everyone calls it Johnston's army, but it's more than that. And so did Edmund Alexander. 2 of those 7 served on the Utah campaign. The one who went south and fought for the Confederacy was, guess who? Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee. Isn't that amazing? All 7 were graduates. So it divided his family. His son-in-law was Jeb Stuart, who married his daughter, Flora, at Fort Riley in about 57 or so. They named their baby P. St. George Cooke Stuart. But when Grandpa stayed with the North and divided the family, they renamed the baby to Jeb Stuart Jr. Now there's a guy in the Confederate Museum and everything in Richmond and all that, Tredegar, and Val Halford may know about this. I think he's Jeb Stuart V or something. But Holy cow, the 7th.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
here is a guy of a slaveholding family decides to stay with the North. Okay. Now, what kind of officer was P. St. George Cooke to the battalion folk?
Disciplinarian, but fair.
Very good. Very good. Very good. I mean, not taken away from anyone else's profession or livelihood. Police officers, firemen, and so on. But soldiers, service members, I don't care. Navy, Air Force, Marines, I don't care. The nature of the calling is to put yourself in harm's way. And you cannot mess around with and have defiance or people that are not following orders. You have to work as a team and as a unit, and that takes discipline. And that's one of the best things about our Army. And the Frontier Army of this time was incredibly disciplined. There was, of course, the desertions here and there. And the Mexican War was one of the worst wars for desertions. But they were very disciplined. Fair, hopefully, some of the time. But Cooke, I mean, if you think the distance of the march is one thing, but just the fact they made it is a huge accomplishment. It's amazing. If you think about who these people were, their amount of training, their expertise, farmers, yes, maybe. Were they frontiersmen yet? No, but by the time they got to Utah, they were. But and to keep that unit intact and get it to California as a fighting force, then they get their training there. That is some serious leadership. Now, I remember some of the journals saying that Cooke was ornery, mean. Some people, I think Corey didn't like me at all, but respected him. So did Hyde, Sergeant Hyde, and others. But that's a Frontier Army officer. All right. So here we have the three commanders that. Then we have Stoneman. We talked about Stoneman. Later became governor of California. He had a rocky Civil War career. I'll tell you that much. But a good officer, class of one of the most distinguished or interesting classes we've had at the Academy, class of 1846. Who was in that class? George McClellan. All right, who has the post, and Stonewall Jackson, and a guy named George Pickett, who was the goat of the class.
Exactly.
Hey, folks, if you ever get a chance to go to a graduation here, the night or two before graduation, they figure out who is the bottom of the class of 1,000 kids, guy or gal, and they take a gathering, what handouts, what's the offering, what's the right word? What am I thinking of? They pass the hat around. And so this goat, they hand them the bag on graduation up on the stand. And there's $1,000 in there, $1,500, and there's more clapping and applaud for that goat, bottom of the class, than the guy who graduates number one. So George Custer was the goat of the class too. And what's the mascot at Navy? Huh? The goat. Okay, thank you. So there we go. Let's see, I hit a lot of things, personalities. If you read and know more about Cooke, he did not really want to be involved with the Utah campaign. He felt the Saints. He had a level of respect and honor for the men and the battalion and their service, and so on, and vice versa. It was a hard love in a way, both ways. But I think the battalion was fortunate to have Allen as the mustering in officer, and his willingness to work with the Latter-day Saints, especially Brigham Young, and then Cooke being a disciplinarian. In my opinion, P. St. George Cooke, antebellum, was probably the second finest or most experienced or Frontier Army officer. Okay, there's a lot of officers did great things with the engineers and the topographical and this and that and quartermaster, but I'm talking about out on the plains, out with the troops. I mean, here's a cavalryman, again, a dragoon, becomes a battalion commander of infantry for 8 or 9 months. All right, so Cooke is just an incredible guy. Had a rocky career under McClellan and Porter. Trying to think of his Fitzjohn Porter got pissed at him, and I think it was at the Battle of Gaines Mill. My right bow was at Gaines Mill on the peninsula where they had a problem. So
yeah, and it continued through Second Manassas.
Yep. And Cooke, because of his age and everything else, they kind of benched him and so on. But anyway, those are just some of the points I wanted to share with you about the battalion. And I respect and honor all that you folks are doing, all the different stories. I think it's wonderful, the work and research on all the musters and all the documents that's going on. The women's story is there and important, and of course there is the children. There's hundreds of stories connected with it and everything. But we should never lose sight of what the battalion was. It was a volunteer battalion, marshaled and mustered to serve in time of war. And there's all the different prophetic things, whether they would see combat or not, which they didn't, but that's what their purpose was. And it was, some people say it was the salvation of the church and so on. Economically, you could argue that and so on. But anyway, that's, unless you have any questions, that's about what I was going to share with you tonight. Was that 20 minutes or longer?
That was just great, Sherman. We thank you for your time and your talents and your research. We appreciate you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a question on the relationship between Hunt and A.J. Smith. Isn't it true that A.J. Smith kind of convinced Hunt that he needed to be the temporary commander because he could get paid, he could get resources from the military where Hunt probably wouldn't be able to?
Yes. The fact that A.J. Smith was a seasoned, even though he's still a first lieutenant, Frontier Army officer, he knew how to deal with animals, with equipment. He knew how to requisition forms through the quartermaster aspect, which would be important at Bent's Fort and then also at Santa Fe. That helps things. If you have a professional doing ordnance or engineering or anything, air defense, artillery, it is so much more helpful. Okay, if you have someone that knows it. And Hunt and team, they were novices. They were somewhere between reception station, basic training, and maybe officer candidate school somewhere. Just because they had taken the oath of office did not make them proficient officers and soldiers. That took months.
I think one reason Jefferson was given Company A was because he was pretty active in the Nauvoo Legion.
Yeah.
And I'm going to share a couple other sources. On Allen, the best source I've found so far is a book called The Rise of the Allens.
Yep.
The author is David Wiggins, Wiggins. You get a much broader understanding of Allen.
So Wiggins has the two brothers that went to West Point, then Benjamin Franklin Allen, who was a nephew. And what they did for, the government, for the country and the Army, but also Iowa is a huge thing. Yes, that's a good source. I have that.
Hey, Sherman, I have a question. And maybe this is beyond the scope of what we're trying to cover tonight, but what was Kearny's view of the battalion?
from what I know, he was just following orders to get it formed, and the officers that he picked to go and lead them, is an indicator that he wanted it to succeed. He was willing to give up two of his most distinguished and efficient, experienced officers to lead this group of trainees. Okay. So I think he had a high opinion. He must have, and he wanted it to work. And orders came down from Marcy, and he was going to make it work. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Any idea what he thought of their effectiveness?
There's a line where he said that, if I remember it right, he said that the saints had been much sinned against because they were great sinners or something like that. Am I quoting that right from Kearny? I think, he was there. He was around the area, Leavenworth, when all this was going on in Missouri. And he probably heard the rumors about the polygamy stuff, all that. So, here's this strange religion that all of a sudden comes up and everything. Said, okay, well, fine. How do we deal with this? Well, we need bodies. Go fight the war. We'll figure that out later. So I think he had a respect, but I don't think he was ready to convert.
Sherman.
Did Kearny feel like he was relegated to kind of a backwater part of the war? There was no really knowing that the Mexicans in California were going to just come up and fight back.
I think that's a good point, Gary. You never know in combat or warfare how things are going to go. There were the huge fights along they were still small battles along the Rio Grande, and then Buena Vista, then in the interior under Scott, as he performed and executed one of the most amazing campaigns in military history. So yeah, if you're a glory hound or think about that, there you go. There it is, so going to California, okay, there were 3 little fights out there in California, and Kearny had a bad day there at San Pasqual. I still think he won the battle, but look what Kearny accomplished. He took New Mexico without firing a shot. Now, there was the big riot and uprising later that Sterling Price put down. And then he gets to California and he deals with a couple fights out there, he and Stockton and so on. But his biggest fight was with Fremont, who's going to be the governor. It's kind of a backwater. This is what I use with the cadets. Let me share this with you, okay? Which of the 2 beaches on Normandy was the most successful for the Americans? Utah Beach or Omaha?
Utah.
Why?
Now, because the Germans weren't nearly as well organized, and because of some terrain features, the bluffs were much higher.
No Coville cliffs, right? Yep.
Yeah.
And both airborne divisions landed behind Utah. So at Omaha, I think the count is around 2,000 dead that day. All right. Utah about 140. So the cadets, that's where all the fighting was, and that's cool. And I said, fighting's cool and neat. Killing people's. No, I said, much more successful Utah Beach because you have less casualties and you get the mission done. So this whole thing about glory and all that, people just have to be careful about. Yeah, it makes more print. It's more exciting what Scott did, what Taylor did. Yeah, there were bigger fights, but Kearny got the territory that became almost a third of the United States. Isn't that amazing?
And can I interject another source? Kearny's letter book. I've had this for probably 5 years, and I've focused on reading the letters. And about 3 months ago, I finally got around to reading the first 125 pages or so. I strongly urge anybody to read that. It will give you a completely different view on how Kearny got to win the West. And so winning the West is well named.
Yep. So in closing, I guess this is it. Unless anyone has any other comments or questions.
One question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Marianne.
Jefferson Hunt, how was he treated once, when Kearny left with Cooke to head back to Fort Leavenworth, Jefferson Hunt, I understand, kind of took command. How was he really in command, or was there somebody over him in the professional military groups?
So there was a New York Volunteers that came around the Horn and everything under Stevenson, and he was the Southern District commander, and Cooke left, and he basically was on the blame line for the battalion as in a way of authority. But it appears that he allowed or delegated the running of the battalion those last 2 months to Hunt. Okay, it's kind of like we have an acting president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles now, right? Greg, do we not have an acting Elder Ballard, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
that is correct, President Ballard. Because otherwise, President
Elder Oaks is the actual president, but he's allowed. But it's just the way they have it in the first president. So that's an example. So yeah, Hunt ran the battalion. He tried to lead up the when they were going to re-enlist, and that didn't go super well. So anyway, good guy that we know of. I think he lived in California later, was in the legislature and a bunch of things like that. Yeah. In the militia. I think he was a brigadier general in the California militia and became a state in 50. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah. Orders.
Sure. Thanks a million.
Yes, sir.
We look forward to seeing you in San Diego in January.
All right. Well, take care, folks.